What I'd like to do also is thank the schools who are here, Eaton Arrowsmith School in Redmond, who's presenting this tonight for Barbara. And then we also have Heritage Arrowsmith School, which is in Bothell, Washington. And we also have the Gateway Arrowsmith School, which is from Bainbridge Island. They're all here tonight, and they have tables out front, so please take opportunity and introduce yourselves to them, and please feel free to pick up any information you're interested in for your take-home. I'd like to start off with an opening video, if I could, so you'll be able to see this on both screens, and we'll move on from that point. So please enjoy this.
Well, hi Barbara. It was really nice having you down here a couple months ago, and I'm really thankful to you for kind of creating this way of learning. It's really helped me a heck of a lot more than you could ever imagine. And I feel like now I can achieve things that would not have ever been possible for me to do. And I'm just really happy that now I have more options in my life and that I can function better. Thank you.
Barbara, thank you so much. I have so much admiration for you that you went through what must have been a dark time in your life, struggling, wondering why such a brilliant mind was having such trouble doing basic things like even reading an analog clock, and how you first accepted the difficulty, which I think we all have to do in our lives, and then you used that acceptance as a springboard to find solutions, not just for yourself, but through your hard work and the work of many others, staff all around the world now, so that people can come with problems that many other places say are just permanent or challenges that can't be addressed. And you say, let's work on it. That's such an amazing gift, Barbara, such an amazing gift. And I feel blessed to be at this school, and I feel blessed that my daughter has had the chance to use the method that you created. Thank you.
Thank you, and then also thank you for being able to help us improve our brains to get back into public school and learn better.
Thank you for giving me my family. It's been awesome.
That person is one of the best people I ever known so far, and if that person hasn't made to school, I wouldn't be reading or writing. And also I might have known this school might have helped a little on the first, but I didn't know it would help so much in just 1 year. Usually in my old school, it would have to take like 3 years just to learn something. But here, I know it right away.
Your vision is true. What you went through and endured and created has changed lives and will continue to change lives. And it's desperately needed in the world. And you have a rare gift and opportunity to change the world for the better, and you're doing it, so we thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
Well, Barbara, when I read your book, even before you talked about your perinatal stroke, I knew that's what it was. And I thought, wow, this woman has worked so hard to change the way that she functions in life. And I am so impressed as a speech pathologist and as a parent, and also somebody who's recovered from a head injury. I'm fantastically impressed and so grateful that you not only did that for yourself and provided that example for everybody, but worked really hard. This must have been a massive project to turn this into something that would work for other people, and then to turn around and to share that with everyone else is a real gift, and I appreciate it. You've done great things for our family, and I'm sure hopefully for other people that I know as well.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. You've instilled a passion in my husband to fight for the causes of our children and to know that there's a future for all children. And I've seen it in my son, and I've seen it in many other children that are part of the Arrowsmith program, and you've lifted their hearts, and that is amazing. They have a new hope and they have a future, and it's because of the Arrowsmith program. So thank you for being the champion and making the big changes in yourself that have really impacted a great community of children. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
I think I can speak for both Heritage and Gateway schools too. We all are incredibly grateful for what Barbara has done for many, many children and even adults throughout the world. And so I thank the families who helped us put this together in honor of bringing Barbara here to town and giving her our thanks and gratitude for all of that hard work and pioneering spirit that she has. So thank you. I'd like to now turn the time over to Mark Watson, who's the CEO of Eaton Arrowsmith Schools and is coming down from Vancouver, British Columbia today. And I'm going to let him introduce Barbara.
All right. Chris, I think those kids introduced Barbara better than I could. All of you are here tonight. You get the opportunity, a rare opportunity, to see a true innovator, leader, compassionate human being who wants to make a difference in the world and continues to do so through great schools and creating and innovating an amazing program that allows students to take control of their education and to shape their futures based on possibility and providing solutions to them that are lifelong. I'm grateful for you. I feel very fortunate to be involved with this work. I've been involved with this work now for 11 years, and it feels like yesterday that I flew off to Toronto to be trained to be a part of this work. I feel extremely grateful to be here with you, to continue to learn from Barbara and her team, and to sit here and learn from you tonight. So Barbara's been doing this work for her whole life. Her first student was herself, and I mean, that's authenticity right there. She knows it, she understands it. So let's all listen up and learn from a true innovator in education.
I want to thank you, Mark, for that introduction, and Chris and the educators that are here from Eaton Arrowsmith Academy and Eaton Arrowsmith School, and from Gateway and from Heritage. So thank you for being part of my vision, and I want to thank everybody that's here in the audience for coming to listen to me tonight, really talk about what I'm most passionate about, which is the human brain and its remarkable capacity for change. So thank you for coming out on a Thursday night to hear me speak. So my life and my work has been an exploration of the territory of the human brain and how it really makes us uniquely who we are. And we know that our brain has a significant impact on shaping us. It really filters our perceptions of ourselves, of our world, our relationship to that world. And to me, what's incredibly promising is, yes, our brain shapes us, but we now know through this concept of neuroplasticity that we can actually shape our brain. And if we think about our brain, it's incredibly complex. It has something on the order of 86 billion neurons. If we think about the world population, it being somewhere between 7 and 8 billion, and that we have 86 billion neurons in our brain, it puts it into perspective in terms of how complex it is. We also have several 100 trillion connections in our brain. And again, to give that some perspective, we have more connections in our brain than all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So incredibly complex. And to me, what's also really, really fascinating is that no two brains are exactly alike. So if you think about a loved one or look at the person sitting next to you in the audience, and you note that there are physical differences between each of you. So you have different eye color, different shape of your nose, shape of your ears. There are actually more differences between your two brains than all of those physical characteristics combined. So our brain really does make us uniquely who we are. And what we know, this concept of neuroplasticity, which simply means that our brain is capable of change as a result of stimulation and as a result of experience. We can grow new neurons, we can increase dendrites, we can increase neurotransmitters, we can actually change the brain at a physiological level to enhance learning. And to me, as I'm getting older, what's really, really promising is there's neuroplasticity across our lifespan. I've worked with people, or children as young as 5 or 6, and I think the oldest student that we've worked with was 81, and there is neuroplasticity across that span. So my story begins with my brain, and it's really a story of personal discovery. It was a hunt fueled by the struggles that I had with very severe and crippling learning disabilities, and it was a hunt for a solution to my problems. And if we imagine having a brain that's capable and incapable at the same time, that's the experience of someone with a learning disability. There's some things that you can do reasonably well and with not a lot of effort, and then there are other things that with the best will and effort in the world, they're just insurmountable, they're impossible. And that was certainly my experience. So growing up, I lived in a world that was incredibly confusing, and for me, language was about as comprehensible as Lewis Carroll's poem, The Jabberwocky. I could hear words, but I struggled to attach meaning to them, comprehension, to understand. It was as if I heard language, but the part of my brain that translated it into meaning wasn't working properly. So I struggled with understanding what people were saying to me. If it was really concrete, like if somebody said it's raining out, which it does in Seattle, I understand, I could understand that because I could conjure up a visual image of rain. But as soon as it got into any kind of abstract concept or relationship, like under, over, bigger than, smaller than, it was hard for me to understand. Or even something as simple as I couldn't understand how my aunt could also be my mother's sister. I didn't understand how someone could have two relationships. Something like fractions. I could understand 1 because I could look at one object. I could understand 4 because I could line up 4 objects. But as soon as you put that 1 over a 4, it's a relationship of a part to a whole. It meant nothing to me, so I couldn't understand fractions. Something like telling time. I mean, I couldn't read an analog clock because to tell time, you have to understand the relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand. It made no sense to me. Things that people take for granted, like understanding jokes. I couldn't, because jokes rely often on irony, and I didn't understand irony. So because I didn't want to feel left out, I learned very early that I should laugh to the same extent that other people were laughing. I had no idea what they were laughing at, but knew that I didn't want to feel left out, so I would gauge my laughter to theirs. And I got labeled very early in school as being rigid and being stubborn. And I was rigid and I was stubborn, but not coming from an emotional place. It was a cognitive difficulty because it was so hard for me to understand my world that if I got any kind of understanding, I held on to it for dear life. It was like, if I grasped something, I was not going to let go of that. And if somebody said, well, compare or contrast or think about this in a different way, there's an alternative, I felt like I had to let go of this to integrate the other information, and that was just too hard. So I was rigid. And for me, it felt like living in a fog all the time. That's what I described my world as. I lived in this fog where meaning was just ephemeral. It would just disappear into a mist. And my world was incredibly fragmented and incredibly fractured. And what happened, because that was my world, is over time it led to a very fragmented and fractured psyche, a very fragmented and fractured self. And if that wasn't enough, that was one area that wasn't working very well, I also had other areas that caused me difficulty. I really struggled with being able to register the location of sensation on the left side of my body. So most people, if you put your hand on a hot burner, your brain registers pain, it registers it in your hand, and you immediately pull it off. Well, I would put my hand on a hot burner, not intentionally, and if I wasn't looking, I experienced pain, but my brain wouldn't tell me where the pain was coming from. So I wouldn't know to lift that hand off. So I learned at a very early age that I had to watch the left side of my body because I truly was a danger to myself. And my mother was convinced that I would be dead by the age of 5 because I was so accident prone, incredibly clumsy, and obviously not able to do well in sports. So I struggled academically, and in school, I was always the last child to be selected for any sports team. And I understand why, because I truly was no asset to any sports team. And I ended up being kind of bruised and banged and physically battered. And imagine if I didn't know where the left side of my body was, when I started to drive a car, I had no idea where the left side of that car was. So my car ended up, well, actually it was my parents' car, but it ended up being bruised and battered on the left side as well, because by extension I just didn't know where it was. And then if that wasn't enough, I had another area of difficulty. I couldn't register three-dimensional space in my brain, which is another area. I couldn't construct maps. So again, something that people take for granted, such as crossing a street, was a terrifying experience for me. Because when you cross a street, one of the things you do is you just create a mental map of where you are relative to that car, that's approaching you. Well, I couldn't do that. So again, as children do with learning difficulties, I developed a compensation. And for me, that would be either to walk blocks out of my way to find a stop sign or a stoplight where I knew the cars had to stop, and then I knew I would be safe crossing. Or my other strategy was to wait at the side of the road until somebody else came along, and I would follow them across the street, and I would pray that they didn't have the same difficulty as I did, and that we'd get across safely. And later, as I got older, just navigating anywhere, I would get lost all of the time because I couldn't interpret maps. I didn't understand how streets connected. Things like geometry, geography, playing chess or checkers, anything that had a spatial component was really, really hard for me. Things like constructing, building an object from a two-dimensional diagram or sewing was really hard. I spent more time probably ripping out seams than actually sewing the seams because I sew things backwards and upside down and inside out. So that was my beginnings. And when I started my schooling, a lot of years ago in the 1950s, the brain was viewed as fixed. It was viewed as what I call, it was the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. So the belief at that time that we were all being educated in was basically the brain that you're born with is the brain that you die with. And if there's a problem, the best you can do is learn to accommodate to that problem. So in grade 1, I overheard my teacher tell my mother that I had a mental block, because this was before the term learning disability even existed. So I guess that was their diagnosis, was a mental block. And being very concrete, I actually thought I had a wooden block in my head that made learning difficult. And what the teacher told my mother is I would never learn like other children, that basically my whole educational career would be an incredible struggle. And there was truth to that because my educational career was an incredible struggle, but it felt like being given a life sentence in grade 1, that basically I was condemned to living in this confusing fog with disconnected elements. And I did have some strengths. I had a verbatim auditory memory. I could just listen to things and almost like a tape recorder remember them. I had a photographic visual memory, so I could look at print and close my eyes and visualize it. And I had incredible drive and determination. And I was very, very lucky. I had a father who had 40 patents to his name. He was an inventor and a scientist. And he instilled in me this belief that if there's a problem and there's no solution out there in the world, he said, your responsibility is to go out and hunt for that solution. And he said something very wise that I've held all my life. He said, don't be limited by conventional wisdom. He said, if the rest of the world tells you you can't do it, he said, don't let that stop you. So I feel like sort of very early on I set out on this quest to find a solution to my difficulties. And for me, the solution came in the work of two brilliant scientists. Alexander Luria, who is a Russian neuropsychologist, who after World War II was studying a lot of Russian soldiers who had very localized head wounds as a result of injuries in the war. And he wrote a book called The Man with the Shattered World that told the story of a Russian soldier who had a very localized head wound. And when I read this book and read this man's description of his difficulties, I thought, this man is living my life, and I'm living his life. Because all the things that he could not do now after that head injury, I hadn't been able to do from birth. And I knew I didn't have a piece of shrapnel in my head, but now I knew at least that it was my brain that wasn't functioning the way it should. And really interestingly, in his journal, he was using the exact same description that I was using in my journal, talking about living in a fog where meaning would just disappear into a mist. So through Luria's work, I now had an identification of what the difficulty was, a part of my brain that wasn't working properly. But then what do I do about that? So at least now I have the source identified, I know the nature of the problem, but what's the solution? So that came in the work of Mark Rosenzweig, who was looking at this concept of neuroplasticity in Berkeley in California. And what he found is he was working with rats because they're a lot easier to work with than people. And he found that if you put rats in a really enriched environment with lots of stimulation and lots of toys to play with, and then you put them in like a little rat intelligence test, which is running a maze, that the rats that had more enrichment and stimulation learned better than the rats that had less stimulation. And then he got to look at their brains. And what he found was that the brains had changed physiologically in those rats with lots of stimulation. More neurotransmitters, more glia cells, more neurons, well, he didn't look at neurons, but more branching, the dendrites on the neurons. So if you think about neurotransmission, the more connections you have, the better the neurotransmission will be. And that's what he found. So he concluded that stimulation leads to physiological brain changes, which leads to better learning. So now I knew, okay, it's my brain that's not working. How do I somehow stimulate, that part of the brain that isn't doing, what it's supposed to do? And, oops, sorry, that's the next slide. So at the age of 26, I created my first exercise for myself. And I thought, even though nobody was really looking at neuroplasticity in humans, it seemed plausible that humans, we must have as much neuroplasticity as rats. And probably we had more. It just seemed to make sense. So I thought it was reasonable to try something. And I was at a pretty dark place in my life at 26. I just saw no future for myself, so didn't know what was going to happen. And so I figured, what was I going to do if I created an exercise? And it didn't work, I was going to just lose some time. And given that I couldn't tell time, really, wasn't a big loss. So I went out and I created my first exercise, which ended up using clocks. Not that I wanted to get better at telling time, but I wanted to find a way to go in and stimulate that function and make it process relationships. And what I did is, I worked very, very hard, and I kept adding more complexity. So I started with 2 hands, then added a 3rd hand, then a 4th hand, and now we have actually clocks that go up to 10 hands. And what it means is processing 10 relationships simultaneously. So the idea is not that we're teaching content or skill, we're trying to work that part of the brain to improve and enhance its functioning and its capacity. And so that was one area. Then the next area that I went to work on was that lack of sensation on the left side of my body, which is the somatosensory cortex. And part of its job is to tell you where the sensation is coming from. And I knew there that the exercise had to involve closing my eyes and making really fine sensory movements, because you have to take away the compensation, and my compensation was using my eyes. So I created a whole complex exercise there, and now I don't bang and bruise and injure myself on the left side. I can register sensation on that left side of my body, and my car doesn't spend time in the auto body shop because I'm not dinging and denting it. So now I created 2 different exercises and seen 2 very different areas of my brain change. I mean, I couldn't go in and look at my brain. I was hypothesizing that it must be the brain that was changing. And then I decided, could I find an exercise or an activity that worked the part of my brain that was involved in spatial relations. So I went ahead and created an exercise to stimulate that area, and now I don't get lost anymore. In fact, I've traveled around the world multiple times in the last 3 years, and I can read maps, I can navigate. Before I had to add in what I called lost time. I would always add a lot of extra time to allow myself to get lost multiple times, and now I don't have to do that. So what I concluded was, yes, there is human neuroplasticity. We can actually go in, and if we can identify the nature of the area and the job that it does and find a task or an activity to work that area, we can actually enhance the function. And so then I went on, well, actually, just go back for a minute. It's interesting, one thing I've learned with this work as well is some of these problems are inherited. Not necessarily all of them, but the spatial difficulty I shared with my mother, and it was always interesting as a child getting into the car with my mother because there were no maps in either of our heads. Like, we knew where we were starting, we kind of knew where we wanted to end up, and it was a black hole in between. But she had a really good attitude. She said, it's going to be an adventure, we're going to get there eventually, and we always did, but never usually the same way twice. But when I got older and I understood a bit more about cognitive function, I asked her, had this ever really impacted her in any way in her life other than took her longer to get places? And so she shared with me that when she'd gone to a university in her first year, she had wanted to be a chemist. This had been a dream of hers. And because of the spatial problem, she couldn't construct molecules. If you think about, you have to construct spatial molecules in her head. So she was encouraged to drop out of chemistry in the first year. So it did have an impact on her. The career that she wanted was really closed to her. I have 4 brothers. One of my brothers has also the spatial difficulty. But my mother and I were probably on the severe end of the spectrum. He was more on the mild end of the spectrum. He did become a chemist at the University of Toronto, but he didn't go into organic chemistry. He went into physical chemistry, which places a bit less of a load on the spatial ability. So what I've learned is any difficulty in a cognitive area will have some impact. It just really depends on the degree of the severity and what that area is. So let's go over this. So again, what I've learned is every one of us has our own unique cognitive profile of strengths and weaknesses. And currently, in the work that I've created, we can identify and work with 19 different cognitive functions. And I'm very clear that that's not everything that can go wrong with learning. It's a very broad base, but there's still more territory to explore. So it's a subset of what can impact learning. And to address a learning problem, my belief is we have to understand that unique cognitive profile and go in and target the areas of difficulty to improve and strengthen and enhance them. So every student that comes into the program is assessed to look at that profile and then receives an individualized program that is specifically tailored to the difficulties that he or she has. And if people are interested, in I think the last several months, we've put a questionnaire on our website. It's what we call the Arrowsmith Cognitive Profile Questionnaire. So you can go in, there's probably something like 300 questions, answer them, and at the end, based on your answers, it will indicate the areas of difficulty that you may have, or you can do it for your child or as one of your students to kind of see what some of those areas might be that are causing them difficulty. And interestingly, the problems range from, the capacity to read nonverbal cues, that child that struggles on the playground because they misinterpret the intentions of other people, the individual that can't hold auditory information. So this is the child that you ask to do 3 things, they walk away, they maybe only do 1. You might think they're irresponsible, but they really just can't hold that information. The child that can't hold the visual look of a word, or the child that can't remember the phonemic pronunciation of a word, executive functioning, thinking, problem solving, reasoning. These are all different cognitive capacities that we can work on and enhance. And one thing also I've learned in this work is there's no one size fits all. If anybody is saying that one program is going to address every single problem, that's not the truth. The brain is way too complex, and we're too complex as unique individuals. We need to find targeted solutions. And if we think about, this is a blood flow study that was done looking at the brain reading out loud. And so there's no one area that just reads. I mean, there are multiple areas. And anybody that's worked with children that are struggling with reading will know that you can have 5 children struggling with reading, and each one has a different profile. It might be the visual look of a word, it might be the phonemic pronunciation, it might be the sound discrimination, it might be the eye tracking and reading. So to address reading, we need to understand which are the component parts for that child that are causing difficulty, and we have programs for each one of these to strengthen them. So if you want to test yourself, you can do it all inside your own head, so you don't have to share it with anybody, and get a sense of where you are on one of these cognitive functions. So if you think of a cat, I think probably everybody here in the room has seen a cat at some point. I own 3 of them. And just close your eyes and see, can you conjure up in your mind's eye a picture or an image of a cat? So whoever wants to do it, and just take a second, see if you can see that cat. And then when you're ready, if you want to open your eyes and see how you did on that continuum. So some people will probably have seen a really vivid image of the cat, like almost as if that cat was right there in their mind's eye. Some might see kind of a vague representation, and then some people will probably just see black, like they'll just see the back of their eyelids. And that's how these cognitive functions operate. They're on a continuum from exceptional ability to coming down to average ability, a mild level of difficulty, a moderate level of difficulty, to a severe level of difficulty. And if we think about this function, if somebody's really strong here, this is the person that can navigate by the look of a place. They go there once, the next time it's like they've got the whole visual, almost like playing a movie inside their head. They remember landmarks, visual imagery, and meditation. If they struggle here, I often joke and call this a refrigerator dysfunction. It's like the person opens the fridge door and they say, "Where's the mustard?" or "Where's the honey?" And there it is, like right in front of them. But they don't hold the look of what they're looking for, like to match it to what they're seeing. So this person will also miss details in what they're looking for. I worked with an illustrator or a person that was studying. She wanted to be an illustrator, and she had this difficulty. So when she was drawing a picture of a cat, she'd leave off the whiskers and wouldn't notice that she left off the whiskers. Or if she's drawing a coat, she'd leave off the buttons or the buttonholes and not notice that. And that's kind of a problem if you're being an illustrator. I mean, you've got to get the details right. So actually, she was one of the people I created this exercise for. And she's now, this was several years ago, she now is an illustrator in Canada, and she wins awards for her illustrations because now she's got the capacity to do that. If somebody has this problem, they can't use visual imagery in meditation. They don't really like that aspect of meditation because, if you close your eyes and conjure up your happy place, they just see the back of their eyelids. It's also the person that, goes on a vacation, comes back, and they can't really remember the look of anything that they've seen. If anybody knows Oliver Sacks's book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, this is this difficulty. I worked with an individual that had traumatic brain injury, in this area. And the first day he came into the school, he tried to exit through a filing cabinet. because it looked like a door. It was rectangular and it had a handle. So an area that maybe won't necessarily impact somebody in school, but will definitely have an impact, in the world. And there's also a part of this region in the brain that allows you to recognize faces. And so if a person has problems here, they'll walk by people they know because they don't recognize them. I've worked with people that they'll know their neighbor if they see their neighbor on their porch because they recognize them in context. 5 minutes later, if they see that neighbor walking down the street, they won't know who they are. So they get labeled as rude or standoffish, which they aren't. They just do not recognize, thank you, that face out of context. And one thing I also want to just point out is a lot of times we look at people's behavior and we interpret it from an emotional base. Like if that person walks by you and doesn't acknowledge you, you think they're rude. But what I'm arguing is we should look at behavior through a cognitive lens. At least in some cases, this might be a cognitive difficulty, not that the person is being rude, or that individual that misinterprets social situations. Again, it may be a cognitive difficulty, not that they're just trying to be difficult. And if we understand it, I think, through a cognitive lens, we can have more compassion and more insight and understanding into that behavior. So we can try this one as well. This is another cognitive function, but so instead of conjuring up the image of a cat, think of the 3 letters, C-A-T. So this is an area in the left hemisphere that's really important for reading, word recognition, for spelling. So again, if you want to try it, you can close your eyes and just see, almost like on a blackboard, can you see those 3 letters sort of written in your mind's eye? And again, what we'll find is some people will see it very clearly, some it might be a little fuzzy, and some might not see anything at all, excuse me. And if there's a real strength here, this is that photographic memory for text, where you can just hold the visual image of text. You're going to learn symbol patterns, even like chemical equations, math formula. You'll learn it as a visual template. If they have a difficulty here, again, poor speller, poor reader, because you are going to see the word multiple times on a page and you're not going to hold it in visual imagery. So if we want to think about what do we do for this area, if there's a difficulty, here's an example of the exercise. So this language that's on the computer screen here that this little boy is looking at it's a language from Ethiopia, it's Amharic. And people often ask, if this child is struggling with English and reading in English, why are we, making him look at Amharic? The idea is for any cognitive exercise, we want to take away compensation. We want to target that cognitive function as much as possible without compensation. If he was looking at English letters, he could put sound to it, he could put meaning to it. So he'd be using other regions of his brain to support the activity. Here, the only way he can do this activity is to hold the visual image of the symbol pattern. So there's a whole process they have to go through. There's something like 44 languages built into the computer program, starting from very simple symbol sets to very complex symbol sets. By the end of the program, the student is able to look at 8 Chinese characters and hold them in their mind's eye. And after that, English actually looks pretty easy. And again, it's not that we're trying to teach them Chinese or Amharic or Sinhalese or Burmese. We're trying to stimulate that part of the brain to hold visual symbol patterns, irrespective of the language. And what we see improve as a result of this activity are things like word recognition, spelling, visual matching, everything that relates to this cognitive function. On our website, we have a series of outcome studies that have been done. This is a brochure that summarizes those. So there have been a number of outcome studies done with different researchers in different schools using different measures. And what we've seen are things like reading improves related to that visual memory activity. Mathematics related to the reasoning, or there's a numeracy activity that we have. Writing, we have a program for learning motor plans in writing. Receptive language improves as a result of a whole number of activities. So this was a study done at the University of Calgary in Canada. And again, if it's kind of hard to see here, but if people want to look at that in more detail, it's on our website. To me, what's also fascinating, we did a study in the Toronto Catholic District School Board, which is a publicly funded board, and what we saw with these students, a lot of them were learning a third of a year or 2/3 of a year per year, which we know students with learning difficulties don't keep up with their peers, so they get further and further behind academically. This was a year after intervention with the cognitive programs. So these students, half of their day were doing no academics. They were looking at these weird symbols, they were doing cognitive exercises. So they were getting less academics than they'd been getting previously. And with less academics, but the cognitive stimulation, they doubled and tripled the rate of learning in word recognition, in reading speed, in mathematics. To me, that's the power of this work. Again, we're not teaching content or skill, we're changing the brain's capacity to learn, and then the brain just starts to learn. And then, again, we've looked at cognitive changes, so changes on cognitive measures, so things like auditory processing, fluid reasoning, memory, and again, this is all on the website, because again, we're changing the brain to be able to do these kinds of processing. And to me, what's really exciting is we're now doing some research, imaging research. We've got a lot of studies that are looking at outcomes, like cognitive tests, rate of learning, academic measures. Now we're actually going in and having an opportunity to look at what is changing in the brain with these students. So there's a study at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver with Dr. Lara Boyd, and then a study at the University of Southern Illinois with Dr. Greg Rose. And what we're seeing, and this research is, Lara Boyd's research is being presented at Columbia University in New York in June. So we're seeing a number of interesting things. And the research right now is very preliminary. It's going to lead definitely to publications in journals. So this is students doing the reasoning exercise, the very first exercise I created for myself using clocks. And what we're seeing, we scanned at time point 0 before intervention, and then 3 months in, and now we've done 10 months. And we found, because I asked to have the students scanned at the 3-month mark, because what we see is students in the program at 3 months start to experience cognitive change. They start to feel an experience that they can do things that they couldn't do before, like that little boy that can do instantaneously what it took him 30 years to do before. It didn't quite look 30, but what we're seeing, we see that with the students at about 3 months, they start to see change, parents start to see change, teachers start to see change. So I wanted to see what was happening in the brain at the 3-month point. So again, very preliminary data, but what we're seeing is there were a number of cortical regions processing more efficiently. So you can see at time point 0, to do an activity was taking a lot more brain real estate than at 3 months in. The brain was processing more efficiently. We're seeing changes in the insula. These are time point 1 and time point 2, and then you subtract the 2 out, and you see what is consistently changing across all of these students. And that's the slide at the bottom, which is showing in every single one, it's the insula. And the insula is a region in the brain that attaches meaning, processes meaning, which makes sense, because these students are doing that reasoning exercise, which allows you to attach meaning to things. So again, confirming that the exercise is changing the brain. And to me, what's really exciting is this is in the resting state, so our brain never really rests. So even when we're resting, there's activity in the brain. At time point 0, and these are all students, identified with learning difficulties, you can see sort of at the front of the brain, I don't want to push any of these buttons, but at this front part of the brain, there's very little activity. It's the prefrontal cortex, and it's really the part of your brain that allows you to think, to plan, to problem solve, to generate strategies, to solve problems. And we know that kids with learning difficulties tend to be pretty disorganized and struggle in that area. And this is what this is confirming, because they had very little activity before intervention. But what we're seeing 3 months in, this prefrontal cortex, it's the very front part of the brain there to the, I don't want to press this, but I think people can see it. It's starting to light up. So we're stimulating that part of the brain that is really critical. It is probably the most important part of the brain that we have, to me, which is really exciting, because we start to see changes in the ability of the student to be self-reflective, to step back, to be more objective, to plan, to think, to problem solve. And it's being confirmed that the brain is changing. I remember one student that came into me, she was, I think, about 19, working on this activity. And she'd gotten into all sorts of trouble growing up, like just really bad decisions, bad judgment because of this difficulty. And I thought she would be really excited as it was changing. And she came in one day really, really depressed, looking depressed, and I asked her what was wrong. And she said, I have a stop sign in my brain now. I don't know that I like it. She said, before I could just do things. And she said, now there's a stop sign telling me that maybe this isn't a good idea. I thought, actually, I think your parents are going to really like that stop sign. And over time, she integrated that, and it was a good thing in her life. But that is what this part of the brain does. It allows you to regulate your behavior. And the other study that we're really excited about in this, Mark Watson, Watson Center for Brain Health in Vancouver, and also I think there's one here in Redmond. We're doing another study at UBC with I'm going to call her Dr. Naz because I still have a bit of the Broca's problem. I can't really pronounce her last name. But we're just finishing, I think it's 9 months of a study working with individuals with traumatic brain injury, because the brain is the brain. Over the years, I mean, this work is initially developed for students struggling with learning difficulties, but we've had students, small number that have had traumatic head injury. And so now we're actually studying what is the impact of this work. And there's an amazing video on our website that was done at UBC with these students, if people are interested to see, the beginning results. So this study was just presented in the Netherlands, I think last week, and has been accepted for publication in the Frontiers of Neuroscience, the Journal of the Frontiers of Neuroscience. So really, really exciting, and we're seeing some really good changes on both cognitive measures and also on imaging. So in terms of cognitive, we're seeing changes in what's called fluid cognition. And why is that important? And this is at the 3-month mark, which is pretty exciting. I mean, fluid cognition, again, is that ability to reason, to think, to problem solve. And what we know is a lot of individuals with traumatic brain injury lose that capacity. And what we're seeing is at the 3-month mark, they're starting to begin to approach individuals that didn't have traumatic brain injury. And I'm going to be really excited to see what our 6-month and our 9-month data is, which just is being analyzed now. And they're also seeing changes in the overall functional organization of the brain. Following this intervention, they're seeing a small increase in myelin, which is the connectivity, all those connections that we have in the brain. So we're getting really interesting results, and our goal is then, once we've got these results and they're published through the Watson Center for Brain Health, is start to apply this work to individuals with traumatic brain injury. I don't know what time it is. Whether I should be 8:06. I'll speed up. What time do you want me to? 8:30. Okay. So if we think about, some additional areas that this work can apply to, I mean, I think I alluded to auditory memory. Interestingly, we think about the person that has to scribble notes. Like, this is the person that is lost without their to-do list. I remember somebody that had Post-it notes all up around their house, because if they didn't have something written down, they would forget to do it because they just can't hold it in their auditory memory. This is the child that comes home and they know they have homework, but they don't really quite recollect what that homework was because they can't hold the instructions unless the teacher writes it down for them. And this is a child that wouldn't like books on tape, right? Because again, they don't really learn from auditory information. And we have programs. We have programs, I think, for 4 different aspects of auditory memory to stimulate that. And I remember one student coming into me one day just so excited. I think, again, she was 17, and she'd won a radio contest that morning. She'd been able to remember the phone number, to remember the instructions, and then to be able to do the skill testing question that was asked to win that contest. So, to me, it's great that they're changing on, tests and measures, but what is more critical is they're able to engage and participate in the world as a result of these cognitive changes. And then there's the ability to understand number, what one researcher calls quantity blindness. So this is the person that 10, 100, 1,000 all means the same thing. I worked with a psychiatrist in Toronto that had this difficulty, and she would double book clients. Not that she wanted to make more money, because she wanted to have 2 people in, but she just didn't have a sense of how long anything took. She couldn't balance her checkbook, always running overtime. I also worked with an opera singer who couldn't do time signature in music because of this difficulty, and she'd failed her theory exam twice and had one more opportunity, and we worked on this function, and she was able to pass that exam. And then, and another thing, somebody with this difficulty, they can run out of gas on the highway because they don't have a sense of, how much gas they need to go for a distance, or they run out of money. I've had, I remember an adult student that had to have envelopes, so when she got her paycheck, she got it cashed, and she'd put a certain amount of money in the envelope marked rent or food, because she'd get to the end of the month if she didn't do that, and she'd have no money. Not that she was irresponsible, she just had no sense of where that money went. And then with the motor plans, this was a student that had a difficulty here. And these are the students that are pretty easy to identify. They can be really articulate. You ask them to tell you a story, they can go on for 10 or 15 minutes. You put a pen or a pencil in their hand, ask them to write that story, and almost nothing goes down on the paper. So they've got the ideas. It's not about not having ideas. They just can't translate those ideas into written expression. So this student was given 10 minutes to write on a topic, and this is what he could write, and you can see it's kind of messy, it's disorganized. And this was, I think it was about 11 months later, same 10 minutes, and this went on for 3 pages. And we didn't work on handwriting. We worked on the cognitive function necessary for motor planning. And again, to me, this is the power of this work. We're not teaching the skill, we're changing the brain's ability to then execute the skill. And then this area is one that is, to me, near and dear to my heart. This is the ability to interpret nonverbal situations. And sometimes people say, well, is that really going to affect the child in school? But it will affect them in the sense that they won't be able to read the nonverbal cues from the teacher. But it's critical for life. One teacher or one researcher calls this cognitive Goldilocks, this area, because it's the area that allows you to project yourself into a situation before you get into that situation. So you know how, say we're going to go to a party, and we kind of start to think and plan before we get into that party of, how do we want to behave? Who do we want to spend time with? What is our intention? And we create a plan, and then we get into the situation, we start to execute the plan, and we start to do moment by moment reading to see, is it going the way we want? And then we start to modify the plan based on the feedback that we're getting from people in the situation. A child or an individual that has trouble here is going to be socially awkward. They're not going to be able to read those cues. They aren't going to be able to learn from feedback. So they get into a lot of difficulty. They do what I call premature closure. They'll look at a situation, they'll pick up one element out of that situation, make an interpretation, and run with that interpretation, but it's not a full interpretation of the situation. So they get into difficulty. So they don't actively survey all the information before acting. This picture, I showed it to a 12-year-old girl that had this difficulty and asked her what did she think was happening in the picture. So she looked at it and looked at me, and she said, they're playing badminton. And I tried to keep a really straight face and asked her why she thought they were playing badminton. I don't know if is that the little, yeah. So I don't know if you can see, she's got netting. This woman has netting on her hat. Like it's sort of the woman that's got her arms outstretched. It's a little unclear in this picture. It's clearer in the original. And what this girl did, if you think about premature closure, she looked really quickly at the picture. She saw the netting. That triggered an association with badminton net, and they're playing badminton. And imagine her social life. Like in her neighborhood, she was on a no-fly zone for playmates. Like nobody wanted to play with her because they all said she lies. And it wasn't that she was lying. This was how she saw her world. We addressed this problem. She's now in her 30s. She's able to interpret nonverbal situations. But it played havoc, with her ability to socialize. Another girl looked at this picture and told me they were at City Hall in Toronto. And I'd been to City Hall many times, and it didn't quite look like that. But she pointed to the rope in the foreground, and she'd been to City Hall the week before, and there was an area cordoned off. So that triggered the association with what she'd seen So again, that nonverbal piece, as we address this, their whole ability to socialize and interact in kind of the nonverbal world shifts. And then the difficulty of individuals with attentional challenges. There are a number of students where we work through the cognitive program, and by the end of it, if they're on medication at the start, probably about 75 to 80% of the students are able to come off medication at the end. And these are the students that have what I call a cognitive load. It's where there are multiple areas that come together to make sitting in class very, very difficult, because they're being asked to do things that take maybe 50 times the energy that it takes other students. As we work on the cognitive functions and lighten that load, they're able to attend without requiring medication. And then there's that group with the prefrontal cortex difficulty, either in the left or right hemisphere. And part of the job of that region of the brain is to regulate attention, goal-directed attention. So it's the thing that, you set a goal for yourself and you stay true to that goal. If there are other distractions coming in, like the butterfly flying outside the window, you realize, well, that's not really going to help me solve this problem, so I'm not going to pay attention to that. If the child has difficulty here, everything is relevant. And as we address those areas, they can start to discriminate what's relevant, what's not relevant to problem solving and regulate their attention. Then if we think about this concept of cognitive mismatch, because I work with a lot of adults, and we do in a number of schools, they do here in Eaton Arrowsmith, that what we find is there are a lot of adults. I have the water up here. It's just, yeah, thanks. Sorry, I just have a little bit of a cold. And I work with a lot of adults where they're in a profession or a career that really doesn't fully match their cognitive profile. So imagine that auditory problem that I described, where you can't hold information. Well, I worked with somebody that was a pilot, and he couldn't remember the instructions from the air traffic controller, which was a little worrisome. So his strategy was get the air traffic controller to repeat those instructions over and over again. My concern was, well, what if you're going into Chicago O'Hare and it's really busy, and that air traffic controller can't repeat those instructions? So I used to joke and tell him if I was getting on an airplane, I'd want to know where he was flying, and I didn't want to be in the same airspace. But the better solution, which is what we did, is we addressed his problem, and now he can hold the auditory information. But I mean, think about, where there are things that we call accidents. It might just be a cognitive mismatch. I also worked with an individual. He was doing his residency in pathology at a teaching hospital in the US, and he had that object recognition problem. He couldn't hold the look of things. So he was examining breast tissue. It was somebody that had breast cancer, and she'd gone through chemotherapy and radiation, and now was to determine was she in remission. And this person knew how important this was. He was really, really careful. And he was just about to sign off that this woman was in remission when his supervisor came and said, didn't you see these cells up here? This is cancer. And he truly, he'd seen the cells, but he couldn't hold the image and match them to what he was looking for, which was cancer. So at that point, he knew he was in trouble, and he exited out, worked on that cognitive function, and won't make that kind of mistake. I've got lots of examples if people are interested in the book of those kind of cognitive mismatches. So just really quickly, if we think about this concept of neuroplasticity, we often think it's a good thing. I mean, it's really a neutral concept. It just means the brain is capable of change. It's capable of change in positive ways and negative ways. And what we really want to do in the work that Arrowsmith does, but also in our lives, in any way that we can reduce those negative factors that are going to lead to cognitive decline and increase the positive factors. So in our life, the things that we can do is how we can reduce chronic stress, because the research certainly shows long-term chronic stress has a negative impact on the brain, prolonged anxiety, chronic pain, and sleep deprivation. So if you want to do anything positive in your life, like start meditating, get out and do some physical activity, reduce stress, it's good for your brain health. And then in terms of increasing the positive factors, I'll just go into the principles of the program that I created, because these all harness those positive factors. is that concept of designing a task that's going to stimulate or work the cognitive function very, very specifically. It's then starting the level of the task just slightly above where the person is currently holding. So that's what the assessment will tell us. So if the student is starting at this level in the function and we need to get them up here, we're not going to start up here because the brain won't be able to engage. You have to calibrate the level of the difficulty just slightly above where the current functioning is. They start the exercise there, they go through a whole process, and then that function steps up. And then we make it more and more difficult. So it's sort of a step-by-step progression. But often these children's experience in school is they go in with the function here, and either the activity is here so they can engage, or then it gets accommodated and modified and it comes down here where it's not doing much in terms of stimulating function. And then one of the hardest things we do is we remove all the supports. Because as soon as we're allowing supports and compensations, the student is diverting energy away from what we're trying to target. And this is one of the hardest things we find for students because compensations have been their lifeline. That's often what they do is they'll learn how to compensate to work around the difficulty. We're going right into the territory of the difficulty to stimulate it. And we do a lot of work with the students helping them understand why that's critical. And then we build in performance criteria, which is accuracy. And to move to another level, the student has to get 90% or better. And some students will put up their hand, but I thought 50% was a pass, but not where the brain is concerned. Like we have to get that level of accuracy to know that capacity is holding there before we make it more difficult. And then they have to do it consistently. So they get that 90% once and they are congratulated, but they have to get it numerous times in a row before, again, we're certain that that function is performing at that level before we make it more difficult. And then they have to be automatic. So if it's taking them 3 minutes and it should be 3 seconds, we have to get them down to 3 seconds. So they meet all that criteria, and then as this little boy is doing, he's mastered that level, and then it's going to go to the next level of difficulty that he needs. And I think I'm just going to quickly just go through these. This is just talking about the meditation. It's really good. Sleep, I mean, there's a lot of research looking at sleep and learning now, which is not particular to my program, but it's good for everybody. And what the research is showing is the top scan is the brain learning something during the day. The next scan is the brain activity at night. And what we're learning is as the person is sleeping, there's a lot of consolidation. A lot of the same areas that were active during the learning process during the day are continuing to be active at night. So if somebody is sleep deprived, they're not really able to build and consolidate memories. So sleep is really important for the brain to learn effectively. And your brain does love the gym. Tremendous amount of research. There's something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is really important. It's important for neurogenesis. It's important for repair of brain cells. The rule of thumb is if it's good for your heart, it's good for your brain. Like good aerobic exercise, as simple as walking, 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, a nice brisk walk, keeps your brain active and healthy. And for me, what is my vision of the future in terms of this work? It's really, we all have a brain. It's critical to learning. I'd like to see every child starting grade 1 where there's good cognitive programming in their grade 1 curriculum. So students come into school, not only are they going to have to learn, but they're going to be stimulating and enhancing their brain, which is how we learn. We learn through our brain. And what would that do? It would remove the stigma from having a learning difficulty, because there is still tremendous stigma that I see there in the world, because it would just be a normal part of curriculum. Every child is engaged in cognitive activity. It would take those individuals that just have unevenness in their profile that I see as adults with those cognitive mismatches, and it would address those very early on. The students that by grade 3 or 4 normally get identified as having a learning difficulty would never get identified, because by grade 3 or 4, those would have been addressed. And then I think, the child that's never going to struggle with learning can still benefit from good cognitive stimulation. So that's my vision. And when I wrote that in the back of my book, I thought, not in my lifetime, I don't think. And interestingly, we have a school in South Carolina that is doing their whole grade 2 class with, I think, 2 of my cognitive exercises. There's a public school in Australia that is starting their incoming grade 1 class on my exercise that works specifically for motor planning and eye tracking and reading, and motor planning for writing, which makes sense in the grade 1 class. And I just got back from Spain last week, and there's a university there, the other end of the spectrum, that's looking at taking my reasoning exercise and putting all of their university students on that reasoning exercise. So what I thought wasn't going to happen in my lifetime is starting. And if we think about, the World Health Organization, their definition of mental health, I think, what I see is a lot of these students as adults that don't have their learning difficulties addressed don't meet this World Health Organization criteria. They don't feel good about themselves. They don't realize their potential. They don't feel that they're really participating in the world. And I think what this work does is it allows these individuals to be fully engaged and participating in the world, and it gives them a different possibility. I mean, a lot of the adults that I work with say, when they came to, choose a career, there was only one door that was open. Like, all of these other doors were closed. And I think what this work does is it opens doors and opens possibilities. And maybe that individual will choose that same door as before, but now it's a choice rather than a forced choice. So I thank you for listening to me talk about this, but I am very passionate about this work. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It was a great talk. It's very exciting to hear all of this. And I also wanted to send out a thanks to Debbie Gilmore, who's here with Barbara from Toronto, who is the executive director of the Arrowsmith program. Also would like to, before we step into our next phase, we're going to do 10 minutes of question and answer. So if you do have a question, I'd like you to raise your hand, and I'll actually see if I can find you out. Hang on just 1 second before we get started with that. I want to thank Aaron Heekin here and the Hyatt Regency for allowing us to be in this facility. It's beautiful. And JT on the back there with AV, so thank you, JT. Rod Butler is actually filming this presentation, so we're going to try to make it available. So if there are people that you know that didn't get to hear this, which I'm sure there's a number of them, we'll direct them via our websites, probably, and maybe the social media, we'll see. And also all the staff who are here from all 3 schools. I know many of our staff are down here from Vancouver, BC, and that's a long drive, and crossing a border is not always easy. It can be nerve-wracking for all of us, right? We get grilled with questions we don't think we know the answers to, but we somehow get across. And thank you to you all for coming tonight. We really do appreciate that. I know Barbara appreciates it a lot. So thank you very much. So what we'd like to do is 10 minutes of question and answer, please, and we'll hold it to that. And after that, Barbara is going to make her way out to the front lobby area where she'd like to socialize and sign books for people. So we'll move to that phase after the question and answer. Okay? So this gentleman.
Have you ever thought of taking some of the things that you've learned and paralleling them into maybe solving some of the problems with Alzheimer's?
It's a really good question. Certainly, I'm not sure. I mean, there's research to suggest that obviously keeping your brain active is really positive in terms of cognitive decline. The concern about Alzheimer's is we don't yet understand all of the mechanisms. And I'm not sure that, once that process is started, that we can do anything to reverse it. Like, it's just not my area of expertise. I certainly believe, though, keeping your brain active and healthy and stimulated can probably slow down that process. I mean, there's research to suggest that, but it's a new frontier, and I can't specifically answer that. The website is arrowsmithschool.org.
As a homeschool mom who has 4 kids with learning disabilities, what can I do in my home and in my day to sort of facilitate? Because they run the gamut of all of this.
is challenging. I mean, we don't have a home-based program at this point, and I'm not sure whether we ever will, because it takes really trained facilitators and teachers to run the program. It's very, very, very complex, and I think it has to be because the brain is very, very complex. I mean, we've got like thousands of levels across, all of the exercises. When we train a teacher and they go back to the school to set up the program, we have staff in Toronto that they can call, liaise with. We have huge tracking systems because I'm committed to every child that's in that program to ensure that they get the best delivery, and the way we can do that is support and work with the teachers. So at this point, we don't have something specific that we can offer. I mean, I know I'm not sure whether all the schools here, I know that Eton Arrowsmith has a part-time program that, individuals can come in and access 4 hours a week. What we find really kind of as a rule of thumb is each area that's being worked on requires about 4 hours per week of the cognitive exercise. I mean, I think the thing you can do at home is like keep them engaged, like try to find the level that is kind of that point at which they can be engaged, where it's a little bit of a strain, but it's not too much of a strain. Like it's kind of try to calibrate, the work that you're doing with them just right sort of above the level that they're functioning at. I mean, that would be my best advice, and being as positive in terms of reinforcing and really listening to them. I mean, I think if I had wanted anything as a child growing up with the struggles that I had, because people didn't really understand. It was like, try harder, you can do better. I mean, I had one student thought her middle name was "you can do better," because that's all she heard. So it's allowing them to really express themselves and listening very deeply.
Yes, would you speak to the issue of a youngster that's in the Arrowsmith program, moving back into, let's say they've been in 2 or 3 years, and now they're moving back into their normal coursework? Would you speak to that generally, the difficulty? And then what percentage of time does that work? And what happens if it doesn't work? What if they don't assimilate well?
Okay. So, they're different things, but in general, what we often will recommend, because they will have been out of curriculum for a period of time. I mean, we just can't do both, right? I mean, it takes work to work these cognitive areas, and as I said, the 4 hours per week is for one area. So a lot of these students are in 4 periods a day working on the cognitive functions before they transition out. So often what we'll recommend is in that transition year is getting some tutoring support. Some students find after they make the transition, they have the tutor in place. After a month, they don't need it anymore. Some will need it over the course of that year. So it's probably a good idea to get some tutoring support just to help them feel confident, because a lot of times they're going to go in with some anxiety. I mean, their experience before the program will be struggle and difficulty. I know for myself, after I addressed the problems, there were things I could do, but I had anxiety because before I couldn't do them. So it took some time to overcome that anxiety to say, yes, I can do that. So often having the tutor is a support, to help alleviate that anxiety, where they know they've got somebody that's going to help them navigate that process, whether they need it just for a few months, whether they need it over the course of the year. So that would be my main recommendation. The other one would be go in and talk to the teachers, or get the Arrowsmith teacher, the teacher that they're with currently, to talk to the teachers that they're going to be transitioning into, whether it's the same school or a new school, to explain where they came from and where they are currently in terms of their cognitive function. If there are any pieces left that that they may need some support with, because sometimes, I don't know the individual specifically, but there may be still a few pieces that aren't quite up to average, but the teacher that's worked with them in the Arrowsmith program can help explain that to the teacher, that they're transitioning into. And if there are challenges or difficulties, I go back and talk to that, that Arrowsmith teacher who can help you through that process. So that would be my best advice.
Is there a small stimulation type thing you need to give an example for, say, to focusing more, like for somebody that might have the ADD?
It is, in a lot of cases, it's that piece of cognitive load. So it can be any combination of the cognitive difficulties that no, I wish. I mean, mindfulness is really good. I mean, it's something. There's certain things that are what I call like the exercise I've designed that are very differentiated, targeted stimulation, and then there are things that are more kind of general based, like. Mindfulness is a general-based activity, and all of the research says that it can help with focusing. So that would be something absolutely that could be useful.
Would you comment, please, on the impact you think video games and all the screen-based activities that children are engaging in?
It's I can't really, because it's outside of the area of my expertise. I mean, one of the things I can comment on is more television and how we use it to some extent. I mean, when I started this work in 78, you know, I was reading Lurie's work, and there was this whole description of the prefrontal cortex, and I was so excited because it sounded like an amazing area, and I wanted to see people that had that difficulty. And probably at that time in the 80s, might have seen 1, 2, 3, 4 students. Now over 50% of the students that we work with, not just in Toronto, but in all the schools, have executive functioning difficulty. And I think what happened over those, 30 years, and I can't be certain, but my hypothesis is we've made everything so simple and pre-digested, right, and passive. And what the prefrontal cortex needs to get stimulation is to be engaged and problem solve and think. So if we're pre-digesting everything for children, we're doing a disservice to the prefrontal cortex. So I mean, that's my hypothesis. Whether video games may do something similar, I don't know, and there's certainly research on that, but it's not something that I have expertise in.
You mentioned the public schools that are trying to integrate some of this into their curriculum. Mm-hmm. How are they doing that in a school day? Are they doing a few exercises during the day? Because I hear you say that there needs to be about 4 hours per
week. So what we're doing in what we call the whole cohort model, which is where you take a whole class. So the grade 1 class, we've trained the grade 1 teacher in that exercise, and the whole class is going to be doing it within the classroom for I think it's a 40-minute period every day, 5 days a week. And it is a school that also has an Arrowsmith classroom. So the traditional model is we train the teacher, they set up a cognitive classroom within their school that students filter in and out over the course of the day. So there might be a student in grade 1, a student in grade 7, a student in grade 8, all coming in to work on their specific cognitive exercise for a certain number of periods, and then going back out into their age-based grade. So that's the traditional model, but now some of the schools are also adding what we call the whole cohort, so that they'll be doing one exercise within their classroom at the same time, the whole grade.
Do you have any research? Is there enough time that's gone by that you have some data to show that is making a difference with a 40-minute period?
Yes, I mean, because in our part-time programs, the 4 hours a week, which we've been doing for a lot of years, we make a difference. I mean, we haven't now, I mean, this whole cohort, I think the South Carolina school's done it for 2 years, and they've seen significant results, and they're expanding it. The grade 1, this is the first time we've done it, but we've done that exercise for 35 years in part-time programs. So we anticipate that we're going to get the same results.
One last question.
Can you speak to assessment, how you assess a child and determine the course of action that you're going to take with that child, and whether or not the child is an appropriate fit for this method?
Yeah. I'll start with the appropriate fit. I mean, what we ask parents often to do is go on the website or look at the book and look at the descriptions, because those are the areas that we work on. So if you read those descriptions and they don't match your child at all, we're probably not a good fit, because those are the areas that we work on. If it looks like that's a good fit, then the next step is have a dialogue. If there's an Arrowsmith school in your area, go and talk to them. If you've had an assessment before, you can bring that in. It's not necessary. So that's in terms of the fit. The assessment process, I've developed tests for each of those 19 areas coming out of really neuroscience, but they're pencil and paper or visual. I mean, we're not going in and looking at the brain. We're looking at behavior and performance on a range of tests. So the teachers, the people that come up to Toronto get trained in that. They bring that methodology back. It's all web-based. I mean, it used to be all pencil and paper before, but now it's all web-based. So the teacher will deliver the assessment. It's about a day, I think, per student to do the assessment, and then they'll get the profile. So it'll look at the 19 areas. It'll say this one is average, it's not a concern, and this is what it is. This one maybe is a mild, and this is what it is, so how it'll impact. So it'll do that, you know, out of the range of difficulties. And then what it'll look at in terms of the program, it'll say, okay, you're going to this school, they offer 4 cognitive periods a day, so that means we can pick from 4 of that profile, and at times there might be 7, 8, 9, 10 areas of difficulty, and depending on the combination for that individual, and if we have 4 slots, we'll determine, okay, this one, this one, this one, and this one are what are critical for that child, and here are the levels. And originally, I've been, as of up until about 3 years ago, I looked at every single one of those files, which I realized that's not really very useful. So I've worked with software developers, and they've taken all that information that I built up over 30 plus years, and that's now all in a computer program. So what used to take me a couple of hours for every student, that computer can do in like 1 second. But it's looking at every single student's profile and creating what we think is the best program for that student.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay.